the US is again one of our biggest trading partners. Without a specific FTA, I think we have to pursue multiple channels, and if a bilateral agreement is in the offing, we should pursue that. If it's likely that there's a change of context, environment, or desire within the US to go back into CPTPP, we should absolutely support that. I don't think we should shut down our options. It's really important.
Hello and welcome to the Friday Download, the podcast where we give you the download on politics and policy and the business of the council leading into the weekend. Let's get into it. I'm Jordan Small. This is the Friday Download. Hello and welcome again to the Friday Download. I'm Jordan Small, Executive Director here at the NZ-US Council. So it's episode 4, 13th of December. And we're a couple of weeks out from Christmas. Last minute shopping, a Christmas tree still to get up, travel arrangements to make, and a lot of program planning for next year, and a podcast to get out each week. It's full steam to the end of the year. But as a council, we are ending the year in a pretty good place, and we'll look at that in next week's show. On that point of getting a podcast out, if you are a new listener or a regular listener, please ensure that you subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Pause right now, subscribe. It's simple and easy to do. Okay, so let me introduce our guest today. He is Chief Executive of Business NZ, New Zealand's leading business advocacy group, representing thousands of businesses of all sizes, and also a member of the NZ-US Council. Kirk, hello and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Great. So are you a podcast listener?
Yes. I occasionally listen to podcasts when I get the time.
Yeah. Well,
maybe on the bike at the gym or something.
Okay. And what are you listening to at the moment?
Philosophize This, which is basically a series of podcasts about philosophy.
Okay. You're a philosopher or
just hark back to some of the stuff that I studied at university around political philosophy, and just to revise and re-engage with it, I guess.
Yeah. I think some of those themes are going to come up in our discussion today. And I guess that they always come up in our kind of work as well, right?
Yeah, it's also, it's important to remind yourself that often it feels like there are new things, but actually many of the themes that we're engaging with are themes that are engaged with by society over our human history. And it's important to remind yourself that it's often we're not recreating the wheel.
Absolutely. Hey, so let's quickly outline what we're going to cover today. So we'll start local on current business conditions and concerns, and then go international with how New Zealand businesses are responding to the uncertainties of the global environment. So there's quite a bit to cover there. Let's get straight into it. So our first clip, which will set up our discussion.
Be concerned. The top 7 concerns of business were all international, focusing particularly on the China-US trade war and uncertainty in Brexit and so on. So those things impact on an open export economy like New Zealand, and so it's understandable that there's a level of concern.
So that was New Zealand's Finance Minister, the Honourable Grant Robertson, talking in September 2019 at the NZ Herald Mood of the Boardroom event. He's referring to an annual survey of New Zealand business leaders, and specifically the factors affecting business confidence. So I'm not sure if he's correct in asserting that the top 7 factors are international, but certainly international factors are weighing on the minds of New Zealand business leaders. So I think a good place to start is on business confidence, because when you look at the headline figures, what you see is GDP growth is pretty solid at 2.4%. You see the share market looking overall okay. And business investment reportedly up 20% this year, but persistently low business confidence levels. And interestingly, when the survey asked businesses to forecast their particular business's prospects, they were a lot less pessimistic. So why is that? How do you explain this mismatch? What's going on?
Probably a couple of points that I'd make would be that to your latter point, actually businesses thoughts, expectations about their own futures are quite a lot more rosy than their view about the general business conditions. So that's quite important, and that their own expectation and views about their own business map quite closely to GDP. So what's going on there? Well, GDP has declined, even though it's still relatively strong, and it's relatively strong compared to, say, many of our trading partners, and many of the Western economies, in particular around the world. It's still declined by about 30%. So that people are feeling that, and that's why, and part of that, and part of their hesitation around investment, again, yes, that's a reasonably strong investment number, up 20% for the year. But again, that's probably less than you would have anticipated. And the reason for that, the primary reason for that, is that businesses have been holding off on investment because there's a general environment of policy uncertainty. Now, what does that mean? Because, people talk about that all the time. I mean, it sounds like a trite line, frankly. Well, if you think about, there's probably 10 policy areas where the new, not so new government now, but the coalition government had raised in the election. And they are areas which really matter to business. So areas like immigration flows, we've got record low unemployment. If I can't get my next worker because they're not available from the domestic labour pool, where am I going to get them from? If a government shuts down my option to be able to access migrant labour. So it's a combination of a range of those policies, increased costs, for example, in the labour market, demands for increased costs, potential for decrease in demand. As I said, actually, GDP has declined by about 30%. So the combination of all of those factors have made particularly small and medium-sized businesses that might not have as much capital as larger businesses to work through much more risk-averse in the current environment, and therefore less inclined to, say, borrow to invest or even invest further capital wherever they're getting it from. So that's really what's been going on. That's how I'd describe it.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously already, or at least internationally, it's very uncertain times. Are business leaders saying, turbulent times ahead, another downturn? There's this guide that's always been out there that we will see a downturn every 10 years, and certainly governments have worked to that kind of guideline. Is that? I mean, what are businesses thinking in that area? What are they picking?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about traditional industries, they themselves are facing a lot of disruption from new and platform-based industries. So it's having to deal with quite a lot of technological change. It's re-engineering your workforce to be agile. So, less people, but with a broader spectrum of skills to be able to respond in a very rapid manner, i.e. in the manner that your customers and other stakeholders are changing the way that they are thinking about the world. Move from, again, a very traditional business model to trying very hard and very quickly to become purpose-driven organisations. So some of those things are really challenging business leaders. Are they seeing a downturn? I mean, we actually saw a bit of an uptick in confidence in the last quarter, and again, there's still plenty of business investment going on, and whilst declining 30%, GDP growth is still pretty strong. I mean, we're heavily exposed, of course, to offshore, the offshore environment. So that's the thing that could have the biggest impact on us if demand out of China dropped by 50%. That would have a big impact on the New Zealand economy. Although we are probably more insulated than we've ever been in terms of free trade agreements. We've got CPTPP. We've got RCEP, which really is ASEAN without India. But again, those and we've got the EU free trade agreement in the offing. If we can push and get it across the line, that gives us probably more markets and better market access than we've had for most of our history. So that's an insulator against being overexposed to individual markets.
Mm. Could we have a look at the political scene and whether that political uncertainty in New Zealand? We've got an election coming up next year. Is that playing into confidence levels?
Probably the policy-making process, because this is, as various politicians will want to say, this is our first real true coalition government. So we've got two agreements which really dominate the policy space, if you like, and that is the supply and demand agreement, the supply and confidence agreement between, getting a bit carried away there, between Labour and the Greens, and then the coalition agreement between Labour and New Zealand First. Now there's some commonality in the policy space across all those three parties, and where anything is outside the commonality across those two agreements, it has to be negotiated, and there will be different positions of each party, and that means that is slowing up and makes that is slowing up the traditional policy process. It's making it harder because it's prone to negotiation, but that's what MMP is about. I mean, if you look in similar styled governments in Europe and other places where you have mixed member proportional systems or proportional systems, things take a lot more time. I think people were getting pretty. I just remember people were getting pretty wound up over the time it was taking to create the government after the last election. I said, well, just bear in mind, in some countries it took. I mean, there were a couple of examples where developing a coalition government took 557 days or something like that. Yeah. So again, we're probably a little bit impatient. One thing I think, which is having an impact, we do have true MMP and true coalition governments which are more representative. Perhaps when MMP was created, we should have had a longer electoral term because things take more time. That's just the nature of it, and that's what we were signing up for when the public committed to moving to the MMP electoral process.
Yeah. So decision making is obviously slower, but is it better? Do you think you get better policy decisions out of MMP governments?
Well, they're certainly more representative.
Yeah.
So if you look, and that's the cost of representation is always going to be time, because it's essentially a collaborative process. People, particularly business people, get immensely frustrated with that and say, "Oh, we're just going to carry on and do our own thing." But does it create better policy? At least you have the opportunity to engage, would be my observation, and get representation.
Yeah, which is, I guess, leads nicely into this was the year of delivery for the Labour government, and I think we've got, what do we got? We've got 15 more days of the year. How would you say they're doing? Actually, let's focus in on what are they doing well.
Nice. Well, I just point to a couple of areas where I think some of the policies that they have implemented as a government will make a difference, perhaps in the short, medium, and long term. So I'll just point to setting up of the Infrastructure Commission. We lobbied hard for the development of the Infrastructure Commission to get a long-term view of infrastructure needs and a strategic view of infrastructure needs across New Zealand. and that was set up. I mean, I think the challenge is that the Commission is not responsible for execution, so that's still done by government departments. I'd say the second thing that again was in response to business leaders was their decision, David Parker's decision to review the Resource Management Act, which we very supportive of. It's been a challenge and an impediment to businesses and communities being able to develop the aforementioned infrastructure over a long period of time, and it hasn't served the environment well. So as a part of the process, we worked with the Environmental Defence Society to say, has this piece of legislation actually worked for the environment? I mean, it certainly hasn't worked for business, but has it done what it said it would do in terms of the environment? And they said they did a long study and found no. So it's really not serving anyone well. So those two things I think are useful. I think probably one piece of legislation which will be enduring is the Zero Carbon Act. Developing of the Climate Commission. If you look at the UK, the carbon budgeting process has really helped them transition out of coal as a fuel for electricity to renewables. It's not going to be as easy for us to do that because we're already heavily into renewables. But again, the framework sets us up for, I think, some better conversations around how we can reduce emissions.
Mm. And so has the business community been broadly supportive of the Zero Carbon Act?
Yeah, I mean, it will depend on which industry, but I think the fact that Shaw managed to get bipartisan support, and that agriculture, people will be frustrated that agriculture, they might feel like agriculture's got an out. I think what it reflects is that agriculture is a massive part of our emissions profile because it's a big part of our economy, and you don't want to cut your nose off to spite your face, frankly. So I think it's a really enduring piece of legislation, and I think a lot of businesses, particularly large businesses, are in behind the idea that we can play a part in reducing emissions. We've seen that with the Climate Leaders Coalition. Now some 130 businesses representing about maybe 60 to 70% of New Zealand's GDP and quite a large proportion of emissions committing to reducing their emissions. So over the next 30 years. So.
Yeah, and I do want to get into that whole license to operate area, corporate social responsibility a little later in this show.
Sure.
But let's finish off this segment by looking at where are they missing the mark, the government.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been pretty slow. I mean, I think they made a real early commitment in a couple of areas around transport, and it really killed the opportunity to develop transport infrastructure quickly. They don't want to go with roading, diverting funding from roading to rail, which again, it's a policy choice, but it comes with some consequences. And the consequences of that when you've got a program, and you've got construction contracts, or at least businesses willing to construct infrastructure in place and ready to go, and you change direction, that people in business will go elsewhere where there are ready projects. And we have to be mindful that we're not, as a country, we're not making these decisions in isolation. I mean, New South Wales has $80 billion worth of infrastructure projects programmed over the next 10 years, ready to roll, and we're competing with that. So we need to be realistic about that.
Yeah. The other area must be Kiwi Build.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kiwi Build has been, I think the government have acknowledged that by removing the targets, they've sort of, they've taken a weight off their shoulders. I think in the failure of Kiwi Build, though, what you have had is a recognition that that housing development in New Zealand has been done poorly. So what you've got now is Kāinga Ora, and that is an amalgamation of all the different parts of the housing system, and it enables Housing New Zealand, for example, to enable construction firms by giving them certainty over what they want to build by way of stock over instead of just 1 year or 2 years or 3 years over multiple periods of time, and that gives those construction firms much greater certainty about income, and therefore they can make investment decisions which are long term rather than short term.
Yeah. So you're saying we don't have on the infrastructure planning, we don't have that 10-year infrastructure plan at the moment that in New South Wales or other markets do?
Well, no, because the prior government had a fairly clear strategic picture around what they wanted to do in the so-called RONs, the roads of national significance. They've moved away from the current government's moved away from that commitment to roading infrastructure. So it's moved into rail, and then decisions need to be long term for rail, and whether it's light rail and quite where it is. You've got the current thinking going on still around what happens between Auckland Central and, say, the airport, how that connects to heavy rail if it's light rail, and so on and so forth. So changing direction has consequences.
Let's take this a little more global and look at some of the geopolitical trends at play. It's clear from the Mood of the Boardroom survey results that these considerations are at the front mind for CEOs and business leaders. And arguably, we've seen quite a change in how this government approaches foreign affairs and trade relationships and geo-strategic tensions. It's a little more challenging, probably a little bit more confronting. You have the Pacific Reset, that it's really a direct response to increased involvement in the Pacific by certain actors. You have the Defence White Paper, again, quite a direct response again. And a foreign minister making a number of speeches in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere that, again, outlines a case for greater US engagement, in particular in this region, Asia Pacific. How does the business community, reacted to that change in approach? And is it something that worries the business community, or they align with?
Look, I mean, I think there's probably two comments that I make around that. Yep. New Zealand has a long-lasting strategic set of relationships, actually, because of where we sit in the world with both the US and China. And given where we sat, being the first signatory to an FTA with China, that relationship is strategic but also quite special. As I said before, the greater diversity that we have in markets where we have better access, particularly for our agricultural products, enable us. Reducing our reliance to a small number of markets weakens us, particularly in an economic downturn, particularly a global economic downturn. So I mean, in terms of foreign affairs, I think there's been a huge investment into the Foreign Affairs Administration in New Zealand, and that's been needed so that foreign affairs policy can be aligned with our trade policy, and ensure that, again, we're not beholden to any one market or one set of markets, that we've actually got a lot more choice. Now, how that marries up with our defence relationships from a business perspective, I mean, those are important. If we're investing, for example, businesses are going to be delivering that. So I think all of these things remain incredibly important for business. Does it make it more uncertain? I think on the opportunity side, I think what you see is actually more opportunity.
Do we? I know one of the questions in the Mood of the Board survey was essentially, do we have too many eggs in the China basket? And 54% of respondents said yes. And there were different views there. Many saying we just need to recognise that a dependence our dependence is significant, even just as a matter of diversifying our risk. So a diversification strategy. What are your, I mean, you've actually already talked about that a bit, but do you have anything to sort of add?
Well, I mean, I think if you think about the reality of CPTPP and then the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, I think within the latter RCEP, so-called RCEP, 58% of New Zealand goods flow into that market. 58% of our exports flow into that market. China's in that agreement, but so are many other ASEAN countries. So again, what we want to be is we want to be as insulated as possible for downturns in specific markets at specific times, and we can do that by simply having better, stronger, and better access-based relationships with as many countries as possible. So I think if you looked back maybe 5 years ago, you would certainly say people would rightly point out, well, a lot of your exports are going to China, and so two-way trade. In the last couple of years since CPTPP, the two-way trade between Japan and New Zealand, for example, has increased about $2.5 billion. So that is roughly about 25%, roughly. That bodes well for, again, breadth and diversity of markets for a lot of what we produce. And I think there's still a really big upside sitting for us in the services sector now. The way that that's treated from a trade and trade protection perspective is a different story. We have to look out for that in terms of privacy, where data is stored, so on and so forth. Those could be trade barriers for a country like New Zealand. But the more markets we have access to and better access, the better off we are.
And of course, the US was a signatory to the TPP, which later became the CPTPP. And, there's a lot of, a large majority, 79% of respondents to that mood of the boardroom survey say, we should be pursuing a free trade agreement with the US with a whole lot of caution, right? Which is, and actually one of the arguments a lot of people make as part of that survey was, should we be waiting for the US to come back into the CPTPP? What are your thoughts on this? Should we be pushing for an FTA at this time? I mean, the council has a position that we should just start. We should start the process, and we should be in the game, acknowledging that it takes a long time to reach these sorts of agreements.
Yeah. So I think, the US is again, one of our biggest trading partners. Without a specific FTA, I think we have to pursue multiple channels. And if a bilateral agreement is in the offing, we should pursue that. If it's likely that there's a change of context, environment, or desire within the US to go back into CPTPP, we should absolutely support that. I don't think we should shut down our options. It's really important. It's a massively important market for us because, again, 450 million odd consumers consuming a lot of the type of stuff that New Zealand produces. And I guess the question is, how could we make that work for both the US and New Zealand? It's probably it's clearly a more mature market than China, but there are still great opportunities for engagement, and we've seen that. I mean, if you look at the film product that is produced out of New Zealand, for example, and the components of film product that are produced out of New Zealand for the American production companies, that is a now enduring and complex product, and that's great. So again, if we would be doing everything that we can to increase that two-way trade, and at the same time pursuing both of those options, because of course CPTPP is not just about New Zealand, it's about everyone else getting together and then the US being able to do a deal that works for them amongst all of those countries.
Yeah. So we make the argument around, as a council, around pursuing a free trade agreement with the US, that one of the things that's unique about the NZ-US trade relationship is just that increasing proportion of that value add services trade, that transformative stuff that is really important for an economy like New Zealand's. So it's like what you're talking about, the creative sectors, film, science, research and science, and a whole bunch of other areas, tech.
Yeah, I think, also I think the innovation and creativity opportunity that is really coming out of New Zealand, we sort of talk about it and we beat ourselves up about it, but in the end, it's those things which are attractive to economies which have a lot of capital, but perhaps they haven't been able to crack the nut of solutions, innovative solutions in particular areas, particularly in technology, and we've seen a couple of examples of that. We could see a lot more, I think.
Yeah, it is quite an exciting space, I think, because I see you're doing a series of interviews with startups and tech companies at the moment, and it does feel as though there's this energy there, and it's right at the, I don't know, there's like about to be a real sort of uptake and transformation in that space.
Well, I mean, I think if you look at some of the technologies that are being exchanged, even between Japan and New Zealand and the US and New Zealand at the moment, so where there are areas of complementarity. So for Japan and New Zealand, there's been a lot of work done on seismic modelling. It's been done with the University of Tokyo. It is just a great example of how you can marry kind of, you've got a mutual problem. You've got some really smart people working in both economies and both jurisdictions using science to help develop solutions, and then you're already working together on that stuff. So those FTAs are really about magnifying the ability of New Zealand to do that with as many countries as possible, and move away really from over commoditizing. So to the point you made earlier about the value add, how we move a lot of our products and services up the value chain.
I've always looked at anything you do in corporate social responsibility, and I've never had this conflict between shareholders and corporate social responsibility. I look at business kind of very personally. If I have a store in a town, it could be a corner bakery store, you participate in the neighborhood. You help the homeless, you might help the local church or synagogue, a little league team, might give some summer jobs. That's what you do. That is called humanity. I've never been conflicted in that.
So that was Jamie Dimon, Global CEO of JP Morgan and Chair of the US Business Roundtable, talking about the role of business in society. As Chair of the US Business Roundtable, he, along with approximately 180 other CEOs of some of the largest companies in the world, recently signed onto the Business Roundtable statement on the purpose of a corporation, which essentially moved away from the goal of maximizing shareholder value and profits to a broader, more stakeholder-focused purpose. This is something that New Zealand businesses seem to be ahead on. And if you look at the mood of the boardroom survey, 86% of CEOs say they're already investing in employees to acquire new skills for the changing workplace. Some 84% say they're supporting local communities and sustainability practices. So, this is an area of focus for the council, the future of work, and looking out, 3 to 5 years and beyond. What is it that, government, business, civil society need to be doing to ensure that there's a transition for workers? So keen to get your thoughts on this area, Kirk, because I know Business New Zealand has been doing a lot of work in this space. So first, I guess maybe the first place to start is, what's your feel for the scale of potential displacement?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, McKinsey globally have done some pretty good work on assessing this for different economies. They've done a New Zealand specific one. It throws up a couple of interesting points. Firstly, whilst tasks will be displaced, jobs will still exist, and in fact, overall, they assess there'll be around 2% of jobs completely lost. So what that means is actually that specific jobs will go, but they'll be replaced by other jobs, and probably more of them in all likelihood. Although there is a tension around the 2% mark. So the other thing that it throws up actually is possibly a more challenging one for both businesses and society in general, and for the policy program for governments to start to think about, and that is that the new jobs essentially carve out at the middle class, if you like. So there are a lot more low-paid jobs and a lot more high-paid jobs. So inequality increases rather significantly. So again, that means that governments will have to focus on and think about, not just the New Zealand government, but all of them, about what policies can be developed to enable people to build both an asset and a high quality income base, and to maintain, to shrink levels of inequality that might become apparent. In New Zealand, as part of the tripartite Future Work Forum, which Business New Zealand, Council of Trade Unions and the government are involved in, we just kind of released a strategic narrative, and that's based, there are 5 kind of broad areas or broad themes: creating more adaptive and resilient institutions, raising workplace productivity and wages, having a responsive skills system which enables learning for life, and helping workers to find and keep decent jobs, and protecting vulnerable workers. So those are roughly the themes. So in terms of a transition process, the key ones there are ensuring that that the skills system is appropriately responsive to enable people to come in and out of learning. There is less, I would assume, in our view, is that there's going to be less formal block type learning. It's going to be much more skills reflective, and the government here have already started to reflect that with micro credentialing. It's not going to be relevant for everybody, but for upskilling and new skilling, this process will have to be sharper.
Yeah. Will that be more workplace?
Training? What we're trying to do is from a Business New Zealand perspective, our role in this is to push the government to better reflect the role of workplace learning in the traditional education system, and ensure that is funded, because currently parts of it are funded, but it's pretty sporadic, and there isn't, there's a real gulf, I would describe it as, between how the formal education system views itself and how it views workplace learning, because they don't, in my view, that they don't pay it enough. They don't pay it enough credit, and they don't value it enough.
Yeah, what do you mean by that? The gulf? Could you explain that a little bit?
Essentially it's that the formal education system is where everything good happens, and workplace learning is just luck if it happens, and we know that is completely untrue. But that gulf is really about people with a particular attitude and view versus people with a different attitude and a different view, and it's a frustration. I think it's been a frustration for business.
Yeah, what do you think the skill set of the future worker is going to be? Because there's different schools of thought, right? There's the we should be teaching I guess students and people, workers, how to think and how to be agile and communication, soft skills. And then there's some schools of thought that are very much around just technical hard skill.
But yeah, I mean, kind of perspective on it is both. Both is still going to be relevant. You'll have your formal program of learning through the schooling system, which will be incredibly important. I actually think one of the areas of focus there is ensuring that particularly kids stay engaged at school for as long as possible and learn as much as possible when they're in those environments. But at the same time, if kids want to experience a job and that they are helped to learn while they're in their workplace as well, so they're not prevented from learning. And I mean, a good example of that would be, an apprentice builder, for example, where, they'll do a lot of foundation learning and then they go into a building site and then they're learning every day. Yeah. There will be, we've seen from some of the experiences in Singapore where there's been a future work program for some time. They had some industry transformation plans, and that's what we've got planned in New Zealand for the Future Work Forum for next year, is looking at particular industries, looking at the particular jobs and tasks and skills that are in those industries today, what they might map to, if that industry wasn't there, what they might map to, what sort of industries they might map to in the future, and find the highest risk ones so that you can enable people to start developing skills that they might need for new jobs when their old job ceases to exist.
Yeah. Where are you seeing, examples of within businesses of these sorts of skills-based programs? Can you kind of point to any particular businesses that you think are doing a really good job at moving their workers into future-based employment jobs?
I'll give you a couple of examples. We had 3 businesses that came to the last Future Work Forum, and the idea was to help to get them to explain quite different programs that they'd put in place to help their workers continually skill. And the purpose there was to say to the forum, we don't need to solve every problem here. What we need to ensure is that the system recognises that these businesses have undertaken good work in retraining and reskilling staff for jobs that might not even exist within their own business. So the businesses were Datacom, and specifically there, their staff have online learning portals, where they collect credits, and that may be maybe for stuff which is not necessarily relevant for their Datacom job, but enables them to continue to skill up. So that's a very practical example. Vodafone, they're obviously an organisation which in the telecommunication space will go through significant workforce changes. So that was about, again, enabling their teams to engage and learn and figure out what might work for them in the future Vodafone, and develop skills that, again, might not even be relevant to them in the new Vodafone, but in another job that they might have. LIC was the third one. And Livestock Improvement Corporation, they had a legacy technology system, and they had 2 types of operators within that system. And so what they did is they said we're moving away from this legacy technology, which was pretty more abound, and we're digitizing a lot of what we do. So those people went through a program that was developed by the Dev Academy, an organisation called the Dev Academy for LIC. So they had about 30 of their what would have been people who would have been redundant who were retrained and reintegrated into the business. So that gives you some practical examples. Some of it may be in the area where they're already working. Some of it may be in completely different areas. I mean, in the LIC example, I think there were some jobs which changed quite substantially. So
and in each of those examples, is that a partnership between the business, government? I mean, what's the government role in there?
Well, I mean, I guess the point that we were trying to make is these are all private organisations, helping their staff skill up with no recognition from the funding the funding pool. So the funding pool really only recognises, that so-called formal education process. LIC paid a lot of money, for example, to develop that bespoke program for their people. It's a big, significant investment.
Yeah. And so you'd like to see basically government recognise, what businesses like this are doing.
Yeah. So the bottom line is what the overall education system needs to the point it needs to develop to is one which recognises that that on the job training is a core part of lifelong learning, and that skills are developed on the job, and that that it's not just sitting in a no disrespect to universities, but it's not just sitting in a chair at a university learning that should garner funding for important learning processes.
Yeah, and that's increasingly, because of the speed of transition and change, right? Technology advancement, etc. You kind of need businesses filling in that gap because they're quicker, right? They're
also,
responsive.
Yeah. One observation that I make, and if we look at tertiary education, the vocational space, businesses will often have up-to-date equipment because their business relies on it, and particularly up-to-date technology, where polytechs might not, and certainly have not. They have dated equipment. It's not up to date because it's just a cost to a polytech as opposed to it's an investment for a business. So if you want to be world leading, competitive, so on and so forth, you need to continue to invest, and businesses have done that.
Yeah. Hey, I just want to round out this segment by going back to that comment we had from Jamie Dimon around, the US Business Roundtable there in a statement saying, hey, we want to move away from this focus on maximizing shareholder value and profit. A lot of that was slammed by a lot of business in the US as, virtue signaling without actually any ability to back it up. What are your quick thoughts on that sort of concept?
Look,
is it even necessary, that kind of statement?
Well, I think as business organisations, I think you do need to take leadership positions in certain ways. Certainly within the Business New Zealand network, we have now members and organisations which describe themselves as purpose driven, and the way in which they engage with customers, engage with broader stakeholders, and engage in the communities that they're involved in is quite different to if they were solely maximising shareholder value. And say, much like Jamie Dimon said in that clip, a lot of it makes also good business sense. For example, if you are in a local community, you're going to be relying on it pays to sponsor, say, for example, a local sports team or a local school, because that's where you're going to get a pool of your people from. And if they already know who you are and know that you're integrated into that community, they're going to trust you a lot more. There's going to be more loyalty. So, I think there's a lot to it. I think there's and to be fair, we've had in some ways, the characterization of business is quite stark. The reality is quite different. As many of our members will tell us, they're deeply involved in their local communities and sometimes in the national communities, and they're committing large amounts of resources to working with people in those communities for exactly the reasons that I've just outlined. Yeah,
I think that's a really great place to leave the discussion, and a positive message there around the engagement in communities and society of New Zealand businesses, which I think is too often forgotten. So, really pleased to have your time today. Thank you very much, and we'll talk again soon. A very short segment on the business of the council today. In in January, the NZ-US Council will be heading to the US, primarily San Francisco and Washington, D.C., for a series of meetings with think tanks, industry associations, and political and policy leaders. So one of the purposes of the trip is to continue to add US thinkers and insight into our various policy programs for 2020. We'll be providing updates while we're there via this podcast, so looking forward to that. Those involved with the Council are free to join us for all or part of the trip, so please get in contact if you're interested. Also, if you are in San Francisco or Washington, D.C. and would like to meet, please get in contact and let's see if we can make it happen. So I think that's a good place to wrap things up. Thanks, Kirk, for sharing the latest thinking of business on some of these big local and global trends, like the future of work, where business and the private sector working together with government is going to be critical. And of course, have a great Christmas and New Year's break. Thanks also to Michael Jeffrey, our NZ-US Council intern, who helps with the production, promotion of this podcast each week. If you are enjoying the podcast, subscribe. Subscribe to this show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It is free and simple, and it's the most important metric of how we're going with this. Please also let us know where we can improve by providing feedback. Our contact details are in the episode notes. So that's another episode down, a quickish download for your weekend thinking. I'm Jordan Small. Join us again next week for the Friday download. Thank you.